So once again I sit down with tea, and my mug is very, very appropriate today because I am reviewing not only a piece of canned lit, but a piece of canned lit that borders on historical fiction. It's not quite historical fiction because it does take place in present day, but at the same time it dips back into Canada's past, into the history of the fur trade in Canada and the Voyageurs. The book is called My True and Complete Adventures as a Wannabe Voyageur, and it's by Phyllis Rudin, or Rudin. I am not entirely sure how the author's name is pronounced. I first laid eyes on this book when it arrived in my mailbox yesterday, and it's quite short, just a couple hundred pages, and I picked it up right away, read it last night, and finished it on my lunch break at work today. Now, full disclosure here, I was actually sent this book by a publisher, by New West Press, which is a Canadian publishing house. I was not familiar with it at all, but the book synopsis caught my eye. I don't usually accept books from publishers, but it was canned lit and I couldn't resist. So this is just going to be my thoughts on it. The book itself was quite good. There were some issues with it, but in terms of a light contemporary novel to read, it was very good, and it's left me with an image in my mind. I was actually riding the bus home after work today and thinking about this novel, and for some reason in my mind I had the image of a canoe, a Voyageur canoe, floating through the air with its paddlers inside, of course, and I could just imagine it perhaps coming out of a misty day, of a foggy morning, just appearing in the field as the bus went by. And I'll get into why that image would come to me a little bit later in this video, because there is indeed a kind of mythical, magical canoe that does appear in the novel. But the fact that this novel gave me such a clear image that's sticking in my mind was really remarkable for me. It was really good news, because so often I read a contemporary novel and I just don't get anything out of it. But even though this is contemporary, it does have some literary aspects to it in that regard. Let me just take a look at my notes in my handy Slytherin notebook. So this is a coming-of-age story. It is about Benji, a 23-year-old young man who, I'm incidentally 23, so I could relate to the character in that way, but it is about a 23-year-old young man living in Montreal. I live in Ottawa. Montreal is about 2 hours from here, just across the border in Quebec, and it's along the St. Lawrence River. Benji is kind of a washout. He didn't do so well in school after the death of his father. He did go to university. He did complete a degree in English, but it wasn't an honors degree. He points that out to us as the reader. It was a general degree. He did not graduate with honors. He has not done well, but his mother has helped him to get a job at the Bay, at Hudson's Bay. For many years, the department chain store was called simply the Bay, but in the last 2 years, I think, they have rebranded and they are once again Hudson's Bay. The Hudson Bay Company is probably the oldest corporation or business in Canada, in the sense that a large portion of the land of what is now central Canada was once owned by this Hudson's Bay Company, by this fur trading company. And so he gets a job in this department store. Kind of imagine it as the Canadian version of Sears, as the Canadian version perhaps Macy's. It's a little more upscale than something like Walmart, for instance, quite a bit more. You go in there and you can expect to pay a couple $100 for a pair of pants, but you can also get like a sweater for like 50. Good quality coats. They sell like the London Fog and the Ivanka Trump, which is really weird when I went in. I'm like, oh, she makes a line of coats. But they also sell furs as well. Just a very large clothing department store, a little more upscale than some of the cheaper brands, but so that's what Hudson's Bay is. Now this is a department store, and Benji's mother works in purses, and he gets the honor of being the caretaker in the Montreal location's little museum, which is meant to kind of commemorate the history of the company and teach customers about the fur trade. He goes in not really knowing anything about the history of the fur trade, about the history of the voyageurs. And he really quickly becomes kind of obsessed with it. He starts to read everything he can get his hands on, and he makes himself an expert. He gets his friends to go out kayaking with him. He teaches himself to kayak and canoe. And he encounters an older gentleman, Maury, who is also obsessed with the fur trade, and they bond over this shared passion. He describes himself as being born in the wrong era, as if fate has played a cruel trick on him, and he believes he was really meant to be a voyageur 400 years ago, working for the Hudson's Bay Company, perhaps, working in the fur trade. Something strange happens, though, when he and Maury are out kayaking one day. They get kind of away from the group of people they've gone with, and they start to hear kind of an eerie, ghostly sound. And this is where the book started to get really exciting for me. It went from, this is kind of an okay book. It's got some great humor. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not particularly splendid. But this is where it really piqued my interest. So they hear this kind of ghostly sound, and they realize there's a canoe coming towards them somewhere nearby. And the rowers are singing, and it's a song that they suspect hasn't been sung in 300 or 400 years. And later on they question what it was, and they come to believe that it was a kind of ghostly crew of these real-life voyageurs who have somehow broken the time-space barrier and come to them. And then there is a story, a myth that Maury tells to Benji. Benji has read it himself, but he has forgotten the details of it. And I'd just like to read that for you, because maybe it's just because I'm Canadian and I live in the central Canada, near an area that was once partially populated by these French-Canadian fur traders, by these voyageurs. I mean, I work in Gatineau, and one of the major roads in Gatineau is Place de Portage. And portage, of course, is what the voyageurs would have done when they carried their canoes, these 700-pound canoes, overland to get past the rapids. In fact, in this particular spot, they would have been bypassing the Chaudière Falls. So I found myself interested in the fur trade, not quite as much as Benji in this novel, but interested in the history of it. And I was remembering my middle school days in a public school in Ontario, learning about these fur traders, learning about, he actually makes a joke about Samuel de Champlain in here, and learning about him and the French-Canadian settlers in Canada. Yes, here we go. It's a folk tale. Maury says, this is Maury speaking, so he says, "These guys were making camp on the Gatineau River," Maury began. "It's winter, New Year's Eve, in fact, and they've all knocked back a few. Late at night, this one guy, Baptiste, shakes awake his friend Joe, and puts a proposition to him. Want to go home to La Vertrie tonight. We'll celebrate Réveillon, get a little New Year's smooch from our girls, and be back in time for breakfast." "Are you nuts?" Joe says to him. "La Vertrie's 300 miles away. It would take us months to get there through the bush. And can I remind you it's winter?" "I'm not talking about slogging there on foot," Baptiste tells him. "We'll travel by canoe there and back in 6 hours top." So by now the cobwebs have cleared a bit from Joe's brain, and he's clued into what his pal is suggesting. That they fly home in their birch bark canoe, navigating through the sky under the devil's protection. "No way, Jose," Joe answers. "I'm not risking my immortal soul for a quickie trip back home, a slice of tortillerie, and a kiss. Count me out. I'll celebrate here with everybody else." But Baptiste badgers him. See, he needs an even number in the canoe, and so far he's only been able to brainwash 6 others into signing on. With himself, that makes 7. "Don't be so yellow-bellied," he says. "I've done it 5 times before, and the devil hasn't bagged me yet. All you have to do is obey a couple of simple rules, that's it. First, whatever you do, don't pronounce the name of Le Bon Dieu during the trip." "How hard is that?" "And second, you don't touch any crosses on the steeples that we pass. If you can just manage those 2 things, then the devil will whiz us home through the air and bring us safely back here in plenty of time. So what do you say, man? Are you in?" At the sight of the others waiting to take off, Joe knuckles under and joins the crowd. They all get in the canoe, and Baptiste recites the incantation that will get the show on the road. Acabra. I'm having trouble with this French. My French really sucks. Acabram, fait nous voyageurs par dessus les montagnes. Sorry about that. Bam, next thing they know, they're up in the air paddling like hell through the sky, singing at the top of their lungs, making for La Vertrie, the full moon lighting their way. They slalom around the steeples and don't nick a single one the whole way. In just under 2 hours, they spot the spires of their destination from the sky and bring the canoe in for a landing in a snowbank, soft as you please. They find out where the New Year's celebration is being held in the village and head that direction. But before Baptiste lets his crew loose on the house party, he issues them a stern warning. "No liquor must pass your lips while you're in there," he says. "You need to keep your wits about you, understood?" The guys all swear to stick to the fruit punch, and they go in and have a high old time. When 4 a.m. chimes, the prearranged time to start heading back, all the crew members quietly slip out of the house, all that is, except for Baptiste, who, as it happens, is drunk as a skunk. They have to drag him out kicking and screaming. Now this is a problem, as you might imagine, since he's the one who's meant to steer the canoe. And besides that, how can they count on him, in this condition, not to blurt out the name of the Lord and damn them all to hell? Well, the clock is ticking, and it's not like they have much choice in the matter, so they plunk him down in a spot at the stern and hope for the best. Cabram, fait nous voyageurs par-dessus les montagnes, take us over the mountains. The canoe shoots up into the air, and they paddle for their very souls. The moon isn't nearly as bright as it was when they set out, and the pickled Baptiste is seeing double. He steers like a wild man, avoiding steeples by a hair, giving his crew a collective coronary. His luck runs out over Montreal, when he drives them smack into the side of the mountain. They pick themselves up out of the snow and assess the damage. No one's hurt, and the canoe's still in one piece. They'll be able to finish the trip. But before they set off again, the fellows get into a quick huddle and decide that they can't stick with Baptiste as their pilot. He's too big a risk. They tie him up and gag him and dump him into the bottom of the canoe. A cabrice, and they say their little incantation again that I've been butchering, but up again for the last time. Joe takes over the steering. He sets their route by the Ottawa River below, and then veers off towards their camp, guided by the North Star. Everything's going according to Holy until they're a few miles short of their destination. That's when Baptiste bolts up in the middle of the canoe. He's wriggled out of his gag and bonds, swearing a blue streak. He holds his paddle out from his body and starts to swing it around and around. Joe ducks down like everybody else to keep from getting his skull bashed in, and in that second of lost concentration he lets the boat dip, and they crash into the crown of the mother of all pine trees. The boat flips over and they all fall out, bumping and crashing their way to the ground against the branches that never seem to end. Next morning Joe wakes up in his own bunk, bruised and scraped some, but none the worse for the wear. Same for the others who shared his midnight adventure. Turns out their stay-behind comrades from camp found them all on a snowbank at the foot of a great pine tree out cold. And so it is implied that perhaps these mysterious voyageurs that Benji and Maury heard singing are perhaps these voyageurs who were cursed in their late night trip on New Year's a few hundred years ago. And I'm running out of time, so that's all I'm going to say about this book. The ending was a little shaky for me, but I'm willing to let that go because I really did enjoy the novel.